Okay, we're good.
Okay, how's that? My name is Sherry Parker. I'm the Vice President and Acting Chair of the League of Women Voters of Lane County. And I also am very passionate about the environment, and we've been doing some plastics collection in order to save plastics from ending up in that beautiful ocean of ours that we protect. So we did a plastics collection at an open house last spring, and we got great response. We're doing another one, and we're combining it with the fruit pickup day. When you come to pick up your fruit on Saturday, December 3rd, if you want to also recycle some plastics that could not be recycled on curbside, you can stop by from 9 to 11:30. I'm asking you to do that by appointment. So you can just send an email to action@Lane County, not spelled out, LWLEC, and then I'll just send an appointment. I can handle a few drop-ins, so don't worry if somehow you just kind of space that out. We're gonna be able to do that. If you recall, you can now recycle number 2 and number 1 plastic bottles, jugs, and jars. But that's it in curbside recycling. So it's been very confusing for people to be able to add on some things and don't understand that you still cannot recycle tubs at curbside, or number 2, number 4, or number 5. So I have these sheets. This will also be an article in the Argus, so you'll get it again, exactly like this. But if you have any questions or want to do recycling, just put it, I didn't print many because I'm paper conscious. You can pass it around the table, write your name on the back, and get it back to me before the end, and I'll get back to you if you have any questions about recycling, if you want to set up an appointment. That way we can kind of get a little bit going ahead of the game. So if you want to know anything about plastics recycling, I'm a community collector with Lane County Waste Management Master Recycling Program. And so you can do recycling through the community collectors program only for these particular items. And these are the ones that need to be clean and label free. Is there a question? Can everybody still hear? Please speak up. Yeah, just holler.
So there's something
But you can't hear.
There's a noise in the ceiling.
Okay, so it's masking the, it's like a fan noise. So if I talk a little bit louder,
Yeah.
every piece of information I've talked about is on this sheet. Pass it around amongst yourselves. If you want any more information or want an appointment, put your name on the back with an email, and I'll be happy to get in touch with you to confirm an appointment. And that's December 3rd when we have fruit pickup, a super.
Terry is particularly concerned about the ocean because she's on it 3 months of the year or more. So sailing the North Pacific. So she's got a very up close and personal relationship with climate. Okay, I'm going to start a little bit and then we'll just have to vamp until the professor gets here. This is the League of Women Voters of Lane County, and we welcome you to our lead speaker series, formerly known as Third Thursday. I'm Charlotte Taylor, current president at League of Women Voters of Lane County, and we acknowledge we live on the traditional land of the California people whose descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, Oregon. We honor the land and the people who have cared for it and reaffirm our commitment to steward and honor the land through our work. We're in the meeting room, as you can tell, of the community at the Marquee, a facility we are sampling in the Eugene Springfield area to see the direction of our league might take to continue our mission of educating our members and others. As you know, with COVID, we've had to ban big time. And we can't predict the future, but we'd like to have some kind of a reliable place to show up. We're gonna always try to do hybrid with all our meetings as much as we're technically able to. And so hopefully down the road, you'll be able to attend in person if you can, if you feel safe enough to do that. And if not, we'll hopefully be able to stream live. Worst case scenario, which is not bad at all, will be on YouTube, and you can look and see what we've done anytime it's convenient for you. So, like I said, we're sampling. If you came to the first one, it was at Valley River, like the old days. The problem with that is that it costs almost double what we charge you. So too expensive to be reasonable. We've got some good reserves, but I'm not sure that's a good way to spend them. So then we went to Campbell House, or not Campbell House, Campbell Community Center, and to see Representative Congressman DeFazio. And as I've told many people, that's been remodeled. It's beautiful, and I want to live in that room. It's so beautiful. Floor to ceiling windows, looking out on the park. Like here, state of the art, audio visual, and not a half bad view itself. Lots of light, really nice place, brand new. So we're gonna keep, as much as we can, keep up doing some kind of speaker series somewhere, somehow, just experimenting. I mean, we don't know what's gonna happen in May, for instance, when we're having the Becky's breathing deeply. Yeah, by the way, Becky Gladstone is our state president of the League of Order. Doing a fabulous job of really difficult circumstances. Yeah, and she's doing a great job. Although I think she's gonna drop it with exhaustion at the end of June when her term is up. Although knowing her, she'll just go on to something else exhausting. But we have a lot of people like that in the league, right? We're gonna have a statewide convention, hopefully here. But we can't predict how many people might be able to come, who would want to come. And then there's the price deal as well. Hotel rooms are expensive nowadays, as they should be. We want to pay people living wages. Same with catering. It's going to be expensive. So to try to plan anything in advance is really tough. You know, and if anybody's got a magic formula or good ideas, we can sure use them. I'd like your opinion about this place. I love it. The food was fabulous, but I'd like to hear from y'all. And my email is in the directory and other places. So you'll send me what thoughts you had on this, on all the ones we've had, if you got the energy. And it's pretty easy, my email, I guess the honors. It's president, y'all know how to spell that, at LWVLC, League of Women Voters of Lake County, .org. So I'd really like to hear from you about anything, actually. Hello. Okay. Are you ready, or should I give you a minute?
Can we get this, get somebody to look at the audio feed?
Because
Because this noise is, if you come back here, there's a popping noise that's very, disruptive, distracting. And it might just be a little feedback, something in the. I mean, is there?
Linda, can you get Nolan in here and see if you can fix that?
Could just be the battery.
I suspect from where you're pointing, it might be the ventilation system. And that, Linda Lynch just made a smart,
No, it's coming from the speaker. It's not the vent. It's coming from the speaker. It's coming from
all the speakers.
Anyways, it would be nice if you can, but,
Well, I suggest that you sit somewhere that's a little more easy to hear without pain. But next, I have a great honor to introduce Professor Gash. I've got a lot to say. Sit back down. Yeah, well, it's all about you. So, I have the great honor to introduce Professor Gash. She looks like a potential leader, doesn't she? Uppity, smart. She's the assistant professor of political science at the U of O. I wrote at the University of Oregon and at the University of Oregon. Yeah, good. Her work has been featured in Slate, Newsweek, Fortune, Politico, Washington Monthly, and The Conversation. Again, a slap. After the presentation, we're going to pass out cards, aren't we? For people to, do we have the cards for people to? Oh, shoot. We're going to have to vamp on that one too. Be preparing your questions for Alison, and I'll read them. Some of you are just too much into using the mic, so we can do it quicker if I read them. So we'll see. From her earlier book, Below the Radar, How Silence Can Save Civil Rights. Ta-da. What an honor that. And I'm paraphrasing some of the flyleaf. Her research explores how policy advocacy mechanisms. A solution, hey. Her research explores how policy advocacy mechanisms shape policy outcomes. This is a real mind bender, I think, for a leading person. I'm sorry.
Oh,
At work. Yeah, thank you. She's written of various forms of legal and political advocacy with a particular focus on civil rights. In examining the strategies used by advocates of gay and lesbian parenthood, Gash argues that advocacy visibility has played a significant role in determining whether advocacy efforts become mired in conflict or bypass hostile backlash politics. Others are not alone in crafting low visibility advocacy strategies to ward off opposition efforts. And for some advocates, secrecy provides the best elixir. I don't know how leaders feel about that, but we understand the motivation. Not every fight for civil rights grabs headlines, sometimes by design. Her groundbreaking analysis of these strategies provide a glimpse of the prophylactic and palliative potential. Yeah, that's okay. Of low visibility advocacy. The league, as I always say, is made up of many political junkies who advocate, discuss, or just dabble. And for those who are here today, I encourage you to read this book. I'll loan it to you if you're careful. And recognize which advocacy strategy is or should be used. Or you could buy it. And maybe the library's got it. Anyway. She's here today to speak on a new topic for you, right? Are you writing a book? I wrote a book, yeah. Oh, why couldn't I find it? All right. Yeah. Huh?
It's on Amazon or where books are sold.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, dang, okay. Child-ish politics, kids in the politics of democratic decline. Welcome, Professor. You're welcome.
So, first off, thank you very much for having me. This is exciting. And, you know, when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about with you all last week or 2 weeks ago, I was anticipating a very different kind of post-election discussion, right? A different set of, post-election.
Oh, you're closer.
Is this good?
I don't know. Not been talking.
There we go. Is that good?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I was just saying that I was anticipating having a very different kind of story to tell. Because I was anticipating that I think a lot of us were a very different kind of electoral backdrop, you know, from the midterm elections. And so, but I wanted to, to think about today, the ways in which young people figure into democratic politics, right? And I've written a book about it. It's called Democracy's Child. Wrote it with, I think, someone who's actually spoken to your organization before, Dan Titchener, who's also a professor at the University of Oregon. But the reason why I think that this topic is really interesting right now is because, of course, if you're a political junkie like I am, we know that one of the very first things to come out of the sort of post-mortem analysis of midterms is the fact that young people showed up, right? Young people, right, in particular Gen Z, showed up. And this is important because we always sort of think about young people around election season, right? So in the month leading up to election season, we sort of engage in the age-old question of, will the young people show up? Will they be lazy? Will this be the generation that stays home? What do we do to get those pesky, disaffected young people to actually care about politics? If only these young kids were like our generation, right? Whichever generation you're in, right? It's always a perennial. If only they were like us and they actually cared about stuff. But the generation these days, right, doesn't care much. And then the reality is that, after election season passes, right, we tend to default to criticisms of young people, right? And in particular, we default to the criticisms of young people when they attempt to protest, or we engage in criticisms of young people when they attempt to articulate some space for free speech, right? Or we engage in some sort of, hand-wringing when they engage in walkouts, or when they ask for, a decrease in the voting age, right? Which now they're asking for 16, right? Now that it's 18, they want 16. Right, and of course the perennial, frequent, ongoing responses to those sorts of things is, right, these young people don't know what they're talking about, right? They're not developmentally able, right, to engage in the kinds of difficult, critical thinking skills required in order to be effective participants in the electoral process, right? This is sort of what we do, right? So on the one, they're damned if they do it, they're damned if they don't, right? If they don't show up to vote, they're lazy. If they do show up, right, and have something to say about some stuff, right, then we say that they don't know what they're talking about, and we close the door, right? So Dan and I both came at this subject from different political or from different policy perspectives. So he was really interested in following young people in the context of immigration reform, in particular in the context of the Dreamers. I was really interested in young people through the context of LGBTQ politics, and sort of recognizing how young people were both the sort of vessels, right, for a really deeply hostile politics around gay and trans rights, but we're also frequently the instigators, right, of those politics and policy reforms. And so it got us thinking about how weird it is that although there's a ton of politics centered on young people, we don't actually think about politics and young people together, except every 2 years when there's an election, right? And we engage in this sort of like, I wonder what young people are going to do. But this year, right? This year we know that young people showed up, right? They showed up, right? They showed up. I think it's the second highest turnout for youth votes in the last 3 decades. I think the highest was 2018. Which was, of course, the midterm election after Trump was voted. So this is the second highest, which is pretty impressive. But what's super interesting about young people in this particular election is that they actually showed up and decided the outcomes of certain key swing vote races, right? We were all expecting this red wave, right? We didn't see the red wave. We saw, red spotting, right? This is the sort of, right? This is the sort of like feminist jargon that's now been deployed, which is awesome and hilarious, right? So there's a little bit of spotting, right? And the reason for the lack of red wave, to a large degree, was the fact that college-age students, right, Gen Z voters, showed up in swing states and decided for Dems by a margin of 28 percentage points, right? So it's not just that they showed up to the polls, right? And it's not just that they skewed Democrat, which they ordinarily do by 8 to 10 percentage points, but that in these key races, they showed up and skewed Democrat in really decisive numbers, right? Which meant that the close races that everyone was watching, right, on Tuesday night and Wednesday night and Thursday and just today, right? Those margins, right? Those vote margins were really small, right? And those margins were in some respects decided by the fact that Gen Z showed up, and they showed up in ways that we hadn't really anticipated because of course they're not captured in the polls. And so, right, it was this sort of big mystery. And so what I want to sort of talk about today is to say, right, that young people are really critical players, really critical populations and demographics in American politics. They always have been, right? But what we haven't captured, right, or until now, until our book sort of does this, is what role they actually do play, and why, right? And this is where it ties back to the midterms, why the role that they actually have played matters for what we saw in the midterm elections, right? And so what I'm going to talk about today for a little bit is just what we think is important about the role that young people play in American politics and how that sort of set them up for this moment that we're seeing right now in terms of Gen Z. So what our book does is it articulates 3 primary ways that we should study the ways in which young people are central actors in American politics. And the first is as subjects of public policy, right? This is sort of the most common way that we think about young people, right? We think about young people as dependents. We think about young people as beneficiaries of a caregiving state, right? We think about young people as more heavily regulated, right? So we think about young people in terms of welfare, in terms of providing stuff, in terms of limiting stuff because they're not developmentally able to do some stuff, right? And then we also think about young people in terms of how to transition them from this phase of being dependent and unable to sort of operate outside of the realm of adult tutelage to, in fact, being their own leaders, right? To being agents of their own kinds of destinies, right? And so in the chapter where we talk about the sort of the subjected nature of young people, right? The fact that they are subjects of public policy, right? We talk about the fact that sometimes these public policies are meant to benefit young people, right? Sometimes, right? This is really about child welfare. This is really about making sure that young people have benefits. This is really about, right, centering young people's needs. Sometimes these public policies are about constraining young people because of the belief that young people can't engage in the kind of independent sort of activity or independent choice that adults can. Sometimes these public policies are about extending, right, adulthood, right, what we call membership, extending membership into adulthood to exceptional young people, right? And here we talk about things like emancipation. We talk about the fact that in certain healthcare moments, young people get to decide, right, their own sort of healthcare destinies. And then we also talk about the ways in which young people are essentially abandoned, right? Essentially promoted to the status of adulthood, even when it is not in their best interest to do so. So here we talk about things like criminal justice, right, where certain demographics of young people, in particular young people of color, are, right, sentenced as adults, right, even though their age would land them in the realm of childhood, right, if they were in a different sort of public policy space. And so here we talk about the abandoning of young people when they are sort of transferred into sort of adult criminal justice realms, right? And this is sort of an interesting chapter, but it's our least interesting chapter. What we're doing in that chapter is to say, we all know, right, that we all know of children as subjects, right? We all know of children as dependents, as, really sort of licensing a sort of heavy-handed state, right? In the sense that states get to do a bunch of stuff in service of these dependents. But what's less known and more important, we argue, is that young people are also symbols, right, and catalysts for change. And in particular, symbols and catalysts for change that are around policies that don't benefit them, but actually benefit adults, right? And so here, there's sort of an interesting form of exploitation of young people that plays out even when the adults are actually on the side of the kids, right? Even when the adults are actually
thinking that they are benefiting young people, they're still exploiting them, right? So here we talk about the civil rights movement, right? And we talk about the fact that during the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders recognized the power of young people as visual platforms for demonstrating the egregious violence of southern racists, right? It's not just pictures of protesters being pinned against walls on fire hoses. It's pictures of young kids, of child protesters being pinned against walls by fire hoses, right? And this is in a way by design, right? Because civil rights leaders understood that if they saw adults being pinned against, walls, right, or being, attacked by German shepherds, maybe we would think twice about it, but probably not, right? But when it's young kids being deployed in that kind of space or being treated in that way, right? People take notice, right? Civil rights leaders understood that, and that was part of the tool, right? Part of the benefits of nonviolent action, of nonviolent protest, was being able to show in stark relief, right, the difference between racist, violent tactics being deployed in the South and the innocence of protesters, right? The most innocent of protesters being nonviolent kids, right? And Martin Luther King had, struggled, right, over whether to do this, right? He understood that he was putting young people in harm's way. But he also understood that the young people were going to put themselves out in the midst of these civil rights debates anyway. And so he wanted to be able to use them in the best way that he could think possible to hammer home the message of the problems of the racist South, right? We talk about a whole bunch of other arenas, right, during the progressive era where young people are deployed by adults in order to get stuff done, right? We talk about, for instance, the Ryan White bill, right? When we talk about AIDS research and the way in which Ryan White, who was a young person who had hemophilia, who was diagnosed with HIV relatively early on in terms of the research dealing with AIDS. And at the time, AIDS research was at a standstill, right? At the time, we sort of identified AIDS as a problem of the gay community, a particular problem of the gay male community. So nobody wanted to fund it. But when Ryan White was contracted AIDS, it was sort of the best thing that ever happened for AIDS research, because suddenly no longer was AIDS associated just with the gay community, the gay male community, but with this, right, this tiny, white upper middle class boy who had contracted hemophilia and now needed, right, to have the AIDS research in order to be able to live a longer life, right? So he became the poster child for AIDS research, right? So again, right, being exploited, right, and again, in ways that benefit him and others like him, but nevertheless being exploited as symbols, right, as catalysts for change. And of course, as soon as Ryan White became the poster child, that's when a whole bunch of public officials understood that they had a safe place, right, to be able to support AIDS research, because without the Ryan Whites of the world, right, they would be stuck sort of championing a cause that was associated with something deeply polarizing, which in that particular moment was support for the LGBT community, right? Now, the question that we asked was, okay, so when kids are sort of deployed, right, we argue that they're sort of exploited and deployed as armies, right? They are catalyzed to support and be out in front of a bunch of issues that aren't necessarily their particular issues, right? They are the issues that are being driven by adult leaders, but nevertheless, right, they sort of become willing participants. But what are the spaces in which young people are deployed? But it's not actual physical young people. It's the idea of young people, right? And so here we see this, and we still saw this a lot in the 1990s in Oregon with ballot measure 9, right? Does anyone remember ballot measure 9, right? So ballot measure 9, or one of the measure 9s, or two of them, one of the measure 9s, both of them dealt with, discriminating, basically outlawing the capacity for the LGBTQ community to seek non-discrimination measures from the state of Oregon, right? And they went one step further and basically banned any sort of discussion of gay families or LGBTQ rights or any sort of anything that pointed to support for the gay community in schools, right? So that meant getting rid of books, that meant getting rid of gay teachers, that meant getting rid of a whole bunch of stuff. We have versions of this today, in lots of states, roughly 8 or 9 states have what are called don't say gay bills, right? Where you, where classrooms are being scrubbed of any sort of anything that would even remotely support LGBTQ families. And the entire reason, or the reason that is sort of given, right? The reason that was given in the 1990s and the reason that's given now is that if you reference sexuality, right, reference gender identity, even if you reference race in the classrooms, that somehow this is bad for kids, right? And so what happened in Oregon was that there's a whole huge campaign, right, where they talked about how kids were endangered by the fact of same-sex families being allowed to be open in the schools, by the fact of gay kids being supported in public schools, that somehow all kids were endangered, right, were endangered. The same kind of logic came up in the same-sex marriage debates, right? So in Oregon ended up banning same-sex marriage, the exact same argument was used, right, that kids were endangered, right? Not just kids being raised by same-sex households, but any kid in school could come home with a book that said, here's how you should be gay, right? And their parents couldn't do anything about it. Suddenly their kid would be gay and the world would end, right? This was sort of the argument, right? That nameless, faceless kids out in the world were going to be endangered and ensnared into, right, recruited into the gay community, right? If any sort of support for gay people were visible in the public schools, right? So this is an example of another form of iconography, another form of the ways in which young people are used as catalysts. In this particular instance, not specific kids, nameless, faceless kids, right, nevertheless are able to drum up a huge amount of support for those public policies. So for instance, in same-sex marriage in Oregon, the #1 reason why lots of voters flooded to the polls to ban same-sex marriage, despite the fact that Oregon's a relatively liberal state, was because of the fear that their children were going to come home gay, right? People were really scared about this, right? So this is why this happened, right? So that's an example of, right, the deployment of young people, right? And it turns out the deployment of young people in this way is a really common tool. It's a really common strategy for public policy, right? But it also invites what we call the agency of young people, right? And as it turns out that when young people are deployed as armies and when they're sort of used as a foil, right, for engaging in deeply problematic and contentious politics, they get sick of it, right? And they get sick of it because they don't, right, because they feel like they don't have a voice, because they feel like when they're used as catalysts and armies and they ask the adult leaders that they're working for, hey, right, can I maybe have a go at doing something that I might think might be really helpful for my particular interests? Oftentimes the adult leaders will say no, right? This happened with the freedom rides. So right, going back to the civil rights movement, when the young people who were themselves being pinned up against the walls by fire hoses said, hey, we have an idea, right? We're actually going to launch us, right? We're going to rent a set of buses. We're going to drive down to the South. We're going to engage in freedom schools, right? We're going to teach young people to read and write, right? We're going to teach folks about their rights. We're going to teach people to be engaged. Adult leaders of the civil rights movement said, no, can't do it. It's too dangerous. Didn't you just have us pinned against the wall with fire hoses? Like, I'm not understanding the sort of warning around danger, right? But they ended up getting into these huge fights with civil rights leaders saying, no, this is the way we should do this. This is the way we think forward for the civil rights movement. And so that's in fact exactly what they did. And so we start to see emerging from these spaces where young people are being deployed as armies or are being used as platforms for contentious politics to start to push back, right? To start to push back on the adults that are supporting them, to start to push back on the adults that are blocking them, right? And we see that most pronounced in terms of Gen Z in March for Our Lives, right? And March for Our Lives and also Black Lives Matter is where we get some of the kernel of why Gen Z showed up the way they did, right? So two things are happening with Gen Z. Two things are happening that are really relevant. The first is, much like the young people of the 1960s, the Gen Z folks have these spaces, right? These training grounds for protests, these training grounds for civic engagement that are not about voting, that are not about, right, supporting institutions, but that are really fundamentally about supporting their voice, supporting their identities, and quite literally supporting their livelihoods, right? And so when kids started to walk out to protest gun violence, and when kids started, especially after Parkland, right, started to lobby their legislators to enact any sort of gun safety measures, let alone good ones, just anything would have been fine. Right, kids started to react when legislators started to say, you don't know what you're talking about, right? Climate reform, right? So Greta Thunberg is powerful, right? Because she's a young person, right? Because people saw her as somebody that was sort of the exception to the rule. How interesting, a young person protesting by herself. Why isn't she at school? Why isn't she, on YouTube, like my kids are, right? Why isn't she stuck to a screen, right? So she incentivized whole bunches of young people to take similar measures, right? To walk out, in some cases to the dismay of school, right? In some cases putting themselves in harm's way because schools didn't want them to actually walk out, right? This generation has grown up, has been trained, right, as teenagers, within these very sort of interesting youth-led, youth-demanded, youth-instigated, powerful protest movements, right? Black Lives Matter. Similarly, right, not only led by young people, but really powerfully populated by young people, such that high school students, 2 or 3 years ago, high school students were getting in skirmishes, right, with people, with police officers, with other people, right, in the context of these Black Lives Matter protests, right, we're experiencing the sorts of conflict politics that we talk about in class firsthand, right? Turns out those sorts of experience matter, right? Those sorts of experience leave an impression. Those sorts of experience leave an impression in ways that school does not, in ways that parental partisanship and parental ideology does not, right? They got to experience the consequences of certain political moves in a real way, and also got to shape the political space within which they were operating and within which adults were operating in a very real way, right? And they did that, as high school students. They did that as 15-year-olds, as 16-year-olds, right? We talk about in our book, right, the large numbers of 16-year-old kids who are leading multinational organizations dealing with like global climate reform, who are literally like engaging with Senate leaders in the middle of heading to their calculus exam, right? I mean, some crazy stories about young people who are taking on these leadership roles, right? We talked about a 15-year-old girl who lives in a conservative area of Texas who thought with her friends, you know what, I think I would like to form a Black Lives Matter protest. It's going to be dangerous. It's just going to be us. It's going to be fine. They posted it to social media. Within 2 days, they had something like 3,000 or 4,000 people who had responded, who wanted to participate. They had to move it to a larger venue. And then they had leaders from all across the state who wanted to come and speak on their behalf. But these are amazing things that young people are doing. And they're not just being affected by it in terms of feeling pleased, right? They're being affected by it and recognizing the power, right, of their own potential for political engagement. But where this differs from the kids of the civil rights era is that kids now get to vote at 18, right? So where the kids of the civil rights era had to wait a bit, right? Had to grow up a bit, right? Had to do some stuff a bit before they could vote. The kids of this era started younger and vote sooner, right? So 2 years after March for Our Lives, 3 years after March for Our Lives, right? The residue of the frustration, right, of legislators saying, you don't have anything to say to us about gun control, right? Gun control is not an issue. When you're older, we'll talk to you. They remember that, right? They were trained, right, in that space at a very pivotal moment, right? And that's why they emerge, right? These kids, like Maxwell Frost, who is the first Gen Z legislator voted to Congress, he cut his teeth on March for Our Lives. That's where he became socially active and politically active, right? Was in the context of March for Our Lives, right? So these protest movements that are part and parcel of youth activism end up becoming far more meaningful at this moment, right? Because we have this really close nexus between the protest training and the capacity for them to vote, right? And then the fact, right, that they became so decisive then has a set of implications for what we do in the future, right? So to what degree, and this is the question that we have to ask, to what degree will young people be able to be deployed in the way that they have been as a politics of adult engagement, right? So all of the stuff around, school-based reforms, right? So the banning of the teaching about race in public schools, the banning of the teaching about gay issues in public schools. All of these things are designed not to deal with children, right? Not to deal with young people, but to get a certain kind of voter and in particular, the white female voter to the polls. That's what they're designed for, right? That these school tactics have always been about getting white women to the polls because they want the moms to come to the polls to protect their children, right? And so now the question is, right, and this is the thing that a lot of these policy officials have never really thought about. Yeah, that voting bloc is paying attention. So are the kids who are being referenced, right, in those spaces, right? So are the kids whose books are being banned, right? Whose teachers are now being gagged in really problematic ways, whose identities are being silenced in really problematic ways. They're listening, right? They're protesting, they're learning, and they're going to actually make their voices known in the next election. So I'm going to cut it there and leave it open for questions.
Yeah, I just need to talk about it. For a long time, I was embarrassed that I was boomer generation, because we were gonna change the world. And look what we've done to it. We've left it to them. So,
But that's what I'll do. We pay it forward. That's okay. In the worst ways.
yeah, right. We borrow it forward.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna ask some questions. Oh, okay, well, walk around. Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
You came out with some statistics that involved 28%. What were you referring to?
So there's a 28%, 28 percentage points difference between youth support for Democrats and youth support for Republicans. So usually the spread, the margin between young Democratic voters and young Republican voters is like 8 to 10%. But in the key swing states where their votes were decisive, the spread was like 28%. Yeah. Which again, in a close race, meant the world.
Do you think it's fair to say that one of the differences between the activist kids now and the activist kids of the 60s is the internet?
Oh, yeah. So, my gosh. Okay.
And that's the-
Yes, thank you. Okay, so, yeah, this is me not having coffee. So the other, right, so there are two things that are super important about the difference between today's kids and yesterday's kids. One is, right, the proximity to voting age. The other is social media. And this, I was just talking to a bunch of kids a few nights ago on a podcast, and I was like, look, the reality is you guys control communication, right? Back in the day, you didn't control communication. Back in the day, it was like elites that controlled communication. But right now, I mean, my colleague and I are looking for, how do we market this book? And then we realized, oh, we got to go on TikTok to market this book. Neither one of us knows remotely how to deal with the algorithms of TikTok at all. So we need to hire, not even a college student, we need to hire a high school student in order to get that work done, right? So high school students and younger college students are now being hired as like the senior staff of communications in nonprofits, because they understand at a sort of atomic level, right, how to market stuff, right? And they end up becoming the primary audiences for a lot of these things. And so they fully control all of these really critical modes of communication, right? And that becomes amazingly important. Thank you for referencing that. Yeah.
Given that Citizens United is still with us,
Yeah.
do you have concerns about lowering the voting age to 16?
Do I have concerns? I don't, I mean, do I think it will happen? Probably not, right? Do I have concerns if it does? Not really. I actually don't. I think that young people in that particular age group come in two flavors, right? One are like the folks who actually don't super care about voting and so won't, right? And then one are the kids who are like incredibly engaged and are really astute observers of political conflict and also fully aware of the implications for the decisions we make now on their livelihoods, right? So this is the first generation of folks who is contemplating, like, realistically not wanting to have children because they don't want to bring children into this world. So if they're having to make that kind of choice, then they should be able to vote, in my opinion, right? If those are the kinds of adult decisions that they're anticipating having to make, I think they should have the capacity to inform policy decisions in the most formal capacity possible.
So are you advocating for an IQ test?
Well, let's just be clear. If we had IQ tests, there's a whole bunch of voters that are way older than 16. who would not pass those IQ tests, which would be okay with me, but that's,
I think
that's
our
no.
leaders think the same thing.
Yeah,
That's our job, is to educate people.
that's right, that's right.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you for challenging us to look at our own past behavior.
Yeah.
And my question is, how the hell do we get out of the way?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I don't actually think it is a function of getting out of the way. I think that, so first of all, I would say, we're talking about Gen Z, right? So Gen Z doesn't have the same sort of like boomer ethos, right? They don't have the same kind of like animosity towards older generations. They're a different kind of generation than the millennials are, right? And so I actually don't think that the sort of notion of adults, and in particular older adults, getting out of the way is appealing to Gen Z, because I think they fundamentally understand that we all need to be like driving the ship in a vastly different direction. And if we're not all driving the ship in a vastly different direction, that ship is going to continue to go towards that iceberg, right? So, I don't think that, I don't think it is a matter of getting out of the way. I think it's a matter of saying, how can we help? What can we do? How can we change the choices that folks are making? Like, how can we make different choices? How can we support what you're doing and listen to you and follow your lead, right? And be supportive, right? Because the other thing is, regardless of whether they're engaged in politics or not, young people are facing a set of like pretty traumatic realities that other kids didn't have to face, right? Certainly some of us did, but a bunch of us didn't, or weren't aware that those traumatic realities were on the horizon. And so creating spaces for young people to be heard, but also to be children, right? Because the one drawback to this is that young people are being robbed of their childhood, right? So I struggle with it. I have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. And at the same time that I'm like dragging them to March for Our Lives protests and like making them go to Black Lives Matter protests and talk to them about like pump book banning, I'm also like, oh, let's also watch some TikTok videos. Some really inane, like, I don't understand what these TikTok videos are about, but like, you need your childhood, you need your space to be a kid, right? So you can be replenished and face these problems head on. And so we need to do both of those things for them.
Just as long as I don't have no TikTok.
I know. I don't think we have to do that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
For your presentation.
Yeah.
today. And I'm an educator, retired.
Thank you very much for your
Can you hear
service.
me?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
And I have experience and been very interested in the degree to which educators are blamed.
Yeah.
For the way young people are today.
Yeah.
And that it's the protection against educators.
Yes. Yeah.
And the blaming that we carry.
Yeah.
That I remember when I was at the university.
Yeah.
Eons ago.
Yeah.
Closer to mine. And there was actually a movement that had people sit in on our teaching.
Yeah.
To judge whether or not what we were teaching was acceptable.
Yeah.
And
Welcome to my
I've
work,
never
by the way.
thought
That's
of
exactly
that.
where we are right now.
yeah,
Yeah, that's where we are right now.
we are with it.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you were addressing that in the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, so, we talk about it a little bit. I think it's definitely something that's a sort of next project. I'm also working on a separate project that looks at schools specifically as locations of political conflict. And here's what I would say. I would say, and this is again, what I told the young people that I was talking to on the podcast the other night, which was, if educators weren't being blamed let me say it this way. Educators are being blamed, schools are being blamed, schools are being targeted because what they're doing is working,
Yes.
right? So the reason why we have attacks on, academic freedom, right? The reasons why we have book bans, right? The reasons why we have the banning of curriculum, the reasons why we have the, the strange modifications of what it means to be required to be a teacher, right? The sort of teacher regs in terms of, who gets to be a teacher are being scaled down dramatically. Those are all happening because the ingredient to progress is education, right? And when young people are educated, they do amazing things and they don't accept the status quo. So if you are somebody who wants the status quo, right? Or if you're somebody who wants to actually go scooch backwards, where do you hit it? You hit it at the root, you hit it at education, right? So the fact that they're going after education isn't because teachers are being blamed for the way that students are turning out. It's actually because teachers are doing an amazing job of helping young people face and contend with and be involved with the really complicated world that they're living in. It's working. We don't want it to work. We need to stop this, right? And so that is in fact what's happening. It doesn't make the reality of it better, right? But I do think that sort of reframing it as, oh, like they're going after us because like this is literally their last hope, right? If they don't find a way to stop the progress, right, and to stop the demands that young people actually have for education, then the ship is going to continue to move away from that iceberg, right, in ways that are really problematic for a certain kind of politics, right? And I told some students the other day, I was like, here's what's super cool about what these book bans and what these curriculum bans are doing. They're making education like radical, right? So when you step foot into my classroom and you learn about the fact that in fact racism exists and there are actual gay people and here's some books about them, right? You are being radicalized, right, in the most amazing way, right? Because I am teaching you, right, what is out there in the world, right? And you get to contend with it, and they don't want you to, because they don't want you to have that knowledge and do with it as you please, right? Which is kind of cool as an educator. It's like, two months ago I was just boring, right? But now when you come in and you learn about some stuff, like it's kind of cool because it's good, right? Yeah.
So I left a youth outreach meeting this morning to come here.
Oh.
And there are so many profound cultural differences. I mean, look around the room.
Yeah.
I mean, for us, youth outreach can include 50-year-olds. But we're really thinking of the group you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
So many things, and
Yeah.
let's list them off.
Yeah.
TLDR.
Yeah.
We're out there.
Yeah.
But the one that struck me this morning was we have to provide clear, this is the opportunity we have for you, this is why you should do this, for money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that hits us as an organizer for this group.
Yeah.
That hits me as a very problematic thing.
Yeah.
Because you're looking at volunteers.
Yeah.
Because you care.
Yeah.
And because we are privileged and
Yeah. Yeah.
we're secure enough to be able to give our time or whatever.
Yeah.
I would love to talk more about the kinds of things that are barriers with this group to reaching younger people.
Yeah.
And I'm almost at the point of thinking, we don't bring them here because we don't know each other. And how do we actually interface effectively? We can bring them into the legislature with us. They can teach us about thunderbolts, but we're not going to go because you can't walk it, in 1 hour's notice.
Right.
How do we effectively interface? And there are so many questions about this.
Yeah.
And we really, really want to reach out to them. I would love to know more about this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And in a way, like I'm in that space as well. I actually just started my own nonprofit called Our School, which is a school specifically, that's not actually a school, it's an online learning community that's explicitly safe and affirming for LGBTQ youth and educators and parents. And so one of the things things that we're sort of struggling with right now is like, we've got this like amazing website, we've got these things we're offering, but how do we get the young people, right? How do we get them here, right, to the space so that they can, you know, either participate as, you know, members or participate as leaders. And it, you know, I think it's hard, but I think there are, I think there's actually ways to do it. So, you know, we're providing internship opportunities. So, and they're not paid, but they're internship opportunities. They're not volunteer, they're internship opportunities. And why that sort of framing is different and helpful is that, you know, there's signaling, right? There's a valuable signal, right, in having an internship, right, and having a leadership role that young people can build on, right, and that other people recognize as being valuable, right? So when I'm hiring young people to do some stuff for the website and to help out in populating, you know, some of the spaces for our classes, right, I hire them as interns, right, I give them leadership positions, I give them almost complete creative control over, you know, what it is they're doing. And I think, you know, I think that helps. And in a way, for some of these kids, it actually, they're sort of agnostic about the money part, mostly because some of these are privileged kids. But they want to be valued, right? They want to be seen and valued and given the sort of credibility that they deserve, right? And that's super important to them. So, and so maybe it's a matter of, you know, changing the sort of programmatic language that you use, right? From like, we need volunteers to come and work with us to, we're going to set up like a formal program where we are going to create youth spaces and have you come in and partner with us on a set of initiatives. I mean, maybe just sort of reframing it that way. It also, you know, I would say working with formal institutions where young people are highly populated, right? So colleges are great, high schools are great. Lots of high schools and colleges, I've just learned, have actual public service requirements, right? So getting connected with the teachers who are organizing those public service requirements is a really great way to do it, right? So plugging into, I think, an infrastructure that is all about encouraging public service and becoming one of those spaces that's on the list is also super helpful, right? So not necessarily connecting with the youth groups themselves, but connecting with the institutions where young people are being sort of encouraged into exactly the kinds of spaces that you're providing. So that would be another way.
By the way, this is the statewide League of Women Voters president. She lives here in town.
I would love to talk to you. Yeah,
Very
definitely.
good.
Yeah, I would love to talk to you.
It always worked for me if they said, no, you can't do that. I was just there.
Yeah. And incidentally, I mean, just as a way of sort of demonstrating youth leadership. So, so my daughter is an artist, and I asked them, hey, would you come up with a picture for my cover? And so they came up with a mock-up, and I sent it to my publisher and my co-author. I didn't say it was my daughter. I said, like, look at this cool thing. Like, let's use this. And we had a bunch of different choices, and the publisher chose this one, which is super cool, right? But it's an example, right, of you know, I ended up paying them, but what they really wanted was their name, right? They wanted their name on the back of the book that said, like, this is my artwork, right? And so that's an example of, like, you know, they want to be seen and included and valued, right? And not put down, right? But also supported and helped and given a childhood.
I want to thank you again for your good work.
Yeah.
Thank you for spending time with us.
Yeah.
You may not be able to answer this now, but I'm assuming you'll be looking at what the youth vote for the measures that we just passed through Oregon for.
Oh, yeah.
Thinking of the gum measure. I'm
Yeah.
thinking that would be really information that is important for us.
Yeah.
To understand it now. Thank you.
Yeah,
Jen.
that's a great question. And I don't have that information yet, in part because there's like the spaces where those votes are broken down in Oregon specifically are not widely obvious. But I do suspect that the youth vote was pretty high in Oregon, which is partly why the protest vote went the way it did. Because, you know, at the last minute, I don't know if folks are aware, but at the last minute, Kotek and Bernie Sanders and a bunch of people went to University of Oregon, right, to campaign, which never, right, that doesn't ever happen, right, that never happens. And yet there they were, right, specifically, right, trying to generate a buzz among the Gen Z voters, right? That was all about getting college kids and specifically UO kids to come and vote, because that's, the margins were gonna be that close, right? And I suspect that probably helped quite a bit.
So I wanted to add to that a little bit different kind of answer. Our mock elections in Oregon, our student mock elections.
Oh,
This year,
interesting.
we had over 5,500 kids participating, and their votes, we didn't get into it with the press too much because we actually wanted to protect the regional responses and understand that that's a trust issue.
Yeah.
But we did give the outcomes to the press, and it was interesting to see how the kids voted. And I really want to emphasize that we're working on a relationship basis, sort of like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Developing relationships like we were talking about, oh, we need to get a volunteer from every league for every school. No. It needs to be absolutely positive. Like, my kids went to that school, that's my school.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be the ambassador or the liaison for that school and make sure that the legacy is represented there. Those kids all get a chance to learn how to vote.
Yeah.
The Oregon Department of Education has called on the League of Women Voters to teach Oregon kids how to vote here. We are very special. We were the first state to take vote by mail. We do things so differently here, and the kids need to know that. I think that to the question of kids voting at 16, that was very unpopular. That would take an incredible heavy capital expenditure for us in the legislature. We're not willing to trade all this other stuff to get 16-year-olds able to vote. The older legislators just don't get it. They're not going there. But getting kids to vote, there were outcomes for how kids voted for these different measures. And it wasn't necessarily regional. It's not like, oh yeah, in the red counties, they're voting just like the
Yeah. And I just want to add to that a little bit, both as a way of sort of complementing what you're saying, and then also as a way of saying that this is another way in which we can connect with young people, which is, the other sort of general way in which young people and educators are being impacted by our current political climate is that, we no longer as a country value civics education, right? So lots of the civics curriculum in a lot of different states are being abolished, and now it's just this focus on, math and science and scooch of reading, but not much. So one of the ways in which, and I think the Oregon story in this new political climate is super interesting, right? So every now and again, Oregon becomes this like beacon of like fascinating politics. And I think this is one of those moments again, where Oregon gets to be super interesting. So A, vote by mail, like, is always super interesting, even more interesting now, right? B, the fact that as a state, we're sort of doubling down on civics education and actually like enfranchising all voters, but especially young people. The fact that as a state, we are not banning curriculum, but really sort of doubling down on the kinds of curriculum that are being rejected and attacked in other states. So it seems to me that the League of Women Voters can be sort of a pivotal partner in exactly those kinds of initiatives and highlighting the importance of those initiatives and highlighting how awesome Oregon is as a place, as a model for voter enfranchisement and civic engagement, even if it's not true, right? Even if it's not true, and even if there's like, clearly struggles, right? In terms of like the narrative relative to these other really scary places in the nation, it's an exciting time to be a young person in Oregon because the story is a little bit different, right? And I think that is really exciting because young people are looking out at the world and they're thinking like, man, democracy is like a dying breed. Like it's a failed experiment, right? That's sort of the story, at least prior to the midterms. And a lot of the talk that I do with my kids is like, yeah, but not here, right? And that ends up being like really compelling, right? Really compelling.
I think you hit on a mutually. Topic here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well,
Thank you.
We're honored and grateful for your work and learning from you. So this is a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah.
And we'll accept the application anytime.
I'll put it in the mail.
It's on the website. We're smart enough to do that. Readers, friends, guests, thanks for coming today. There will be no speaker series in December. There's enough to do then, right? So stay tuned, watch our website, newsletter, and our other media, probably not TikTok. I don't know. Maybe down the road, I'd like to see 2 or 3 tiers of effort. Bogies, the people we birthed and raised, and then the other level. I mean, we do a lot of stuff for our age. This is during the week, during the day, when the people we really like to see come are either at school or at work. So we need to work on that. And maybe some kind of partnership will help with that. So, okay. Well, thanks for coming. Goodbye. Stay safe. Thank you. Be careful. Thank you.